Good afternoon. Today we'll be discussing the accessibility to activities based on the current user permissions. So let's get into it. The setup for some context here, we'll be looking at a UI builder page with a playbook on it, a playbook component, and that playbook component will be using a custom playbook experience record, which is really important, and a custom table that doesn't extend any existing table. It's just a table that's been created in the global scope. So going into the playbook experience, right, which is that property of the playbook experience component where a lot of the settings are placed and many other things, you'll see there is a playbook configuration record, which we will click into. And the playbook configuration record is where the accessibility for a particular activity is set in some ways. So the property to whether or not you can hide an activity is set in this location. Not activity overrides, not directly with the ACLs, which are involved in this process, but aren't the only part required to configure in order to hide activities based on the current user's permissions. Right? So we're looking at this particular property, the inaccessible data visibility property of the playbook configuration record within our custom playbook experience. And there are only two settings really, as far as I know. Hide inaccessible data from activities. So for example, let's say you have a field from another table that the current user is not supposed to have access to, then you'll want to hide that, from being entered or read on the activity. And so typically that's the default setting from what I recall. But let's say, for example, you don't want the user to see that activity if they don't have access to that card. This is when that property, this setting for this property, would come in handy. Hide activities with inaccessible data. So specifically the activities you're hiding, not the data, you're hiding activities. So that's already a setting we have on this particular playbook experience. So let's go ahead and take a look at the process definition, and then we'll look at the actual playbook. So this is the process definition. We have an instruction card. We have a user form card, nothing special, right? That's the activity definition. And we have another user form card. And the difference between these two user form cards is that one is for the test table, right? And one is for the incident table, right? Ignore everything else for the sake of the example. And what will happen is, since our test user only has access to read, write, create, and delete for the test table, they won't or shouldn't see the incident table. So let's go and show what that looks like. So you'll see here that we have two lanes showing, and that the third lane isn't showing at all. And that's because if there's only a single activity in that lane, and if that activity is restricted, then the lane itself will not show as well. And so we can continue our process as we would normally, and then continue the playbook. Right? There are a few caveats that I want to cover in an additional video, and I will go into that. But this is how it looks when you hide activities where the data is not accessible from the current user. Okay, this portion of the video is to call out those advanced items I wanted to cover in terms of configuring activities that would hide based on the current user's roles. So the page we're on now is the documentation page relating to this feature. And one thing I want to call out here is the documentation is a little bit vague on this particular feature because it only mentions if the current users do not have permissions to view the data. So you might be able to assume that if you have a table that the user can access, but then you have a field that the user shouldn't access, and let's say you put that field on the form fields portion of, let's say, user form activity. All right, the assumption here is, well, since the user should not have access to view this field, the activity should be hidden. From all my tests, this is not true. The only level of access that I've been able to determine that this feature looks at is a table. So let's say you have access to read the table, but certain fields you don't have access to read, and you put that field here, you'll still be able to see this activity. Except the activity will just only show a skip button, and it won't show you the actual field. To illustrate this configuration, I'll show you an example of what it looks like. We have an ACL here for the test table. For the description field on that test table, it's active, and it looks for users with these roles, right? But it's always going to return false, right? So if you know about ACLs, you know first you're looking at the level, the operation, the type. But the important thing to take here is that it will always be false. So the user with admin or test table user role will not be able to read this field, right? And this works on the back end perfectly fine. It also kind of works on the front end in the playbook. It's just not as expected. It's not what you'd think. So let's go ahead and show what that looks like. All right. And just to show you what it currently looks like, it's already doing it, which is good. So we know the change is effective. But let's go ahead and update this. All right, we have a brand new test table record. Right, we're starting off here. This is just an instruction card. And so the user technically does not have access to view this piece of data, right? And that's I think my takeaway here is if they have permission to view the data, right, associated with the activity, right? They don't have permission to view the data, but specifically this property is only looking at the table level access. It's not looking at the field level access at all, as far as I can tell. So in a situation where you want to hide an activity based off of whether that user can access the field, you might run into more difficulties there. I'm not sure exactly what the solution would be. Would have to further investigate it. The next call out I want to take time for regards the process definition. So same situation where you're trying to hide an activity based on whether that user has access to the table associated with the activity. Very important distinction that I mentioned in a previous call out, right? If that user does not have table level access, then they can't see the activity. But if they do have table level access, then they can see it. And to add on to that, if they have table level access, but they're not supposed to see certain fields, and let's say, for example, you ask for those fields to be shown in this particular activity, it's still going to show you the activity, it's just not going to show you the field. So the next call out I want to take time for it regards the hiding lane and hiding card feature So one assumption can be made where you don't want this lane to show up prior to the next lane, right? So if you're familiar with when to start property on the process definition lane in activities, you'll know that when to start relates to the entire process, right? Is it supposed to start after the previous lane? It's supposed to it's pretty straightforward, so I won't go into that. But one counterintuitive configuration that's required to hide activities based on the user role is you need to set the start condition to run immediately. So I'll show you what that looks like when you don't do that, right? So we know the configuration here. The user doesn't have access to the incident table, and the activity, because it's associated with that table the user does not have access to, should be hidden. And because there's no other activities in that lane that the user does have access to, the whole lane should be hidden. That's just a default property, default setting. So when you look at this, let's make a new record here real quick because this is a bad example. So when you look at this record that we just created, you'll notice that the hide lane is showing. There's probably a call stack related reason for this, but the solution is to make sure that lane just runs immediately, because if you don't run it immediately, it won't hide itself, right? And I'll show you what it looks like when it's not hiding itself automatically, but there's a collision with the current user permissions, right? Let's mark this complete, and let's go into that lane. It'll automatically go into that lane, and it'll be permanently stuck in a loading phase until you refresh the page, and then the hide activity feature will come into play after you refresh the page. So just a little caveat there, and I'll show what it looks like when it's working properly. So this is what it looks like when it's running properly, and when you set the lane or activity that should be hidden based on the user role to start immediately. So the big takeaway here is, if you have an activity that may need to be hidden based on whether or not the user has permissions to access that table, you need to make sure that the activity and the lane are immediately starting. And this is also not really stated anywhere in the documentation, so just making the call out here, and then you'll see it working over here. So as long as it starts immediately, then it'll automatically hide it, because the current test user does not have access to that table.